There are paintings the world calls masterpieces. And then there are those that whisper to you when the room is silent. In 1897, a portrait was commissioned in New England. Two sisters seated side by side, dressed in white muslin, with the stern posture and pale grace typical of the era. At first glance, it is nothing more than a relic of genteel family pride, another heirloom meant to immortalize lineage. But men who have looked closer, who have studied the canvas under low lamplight, will tell you something is wrong. Not with the brush strokes, not with the symmetry, but with the eyes. The eyes in that painting do not sit still. They do not simply follow you in the parlor trick way of oil portraits. They seem aware, as if the girls painted over a century ago are not frozen in time at all, but watching, waiting. And when you begin to trace the story behind them, you discover that their gaze was never innocent. The sisters were not ordinary children. Their family was bound to a network of spiritualists and secret societies that swept across America in the late 19th century, a time when seances, ghost photography, and whispered rites filled drawing rooms from Boston to New York. To the public, it was entertainment. To the elite, it was initiation. And the portrait? It was not just a keepsake. It was a ritual object. The artist, little known but deeply connected to esoteric circles, believed the eyes were windows, not symbols, but conduits. What if those painted pupils were never meant to capture the girl's likeness, but to house something else? Something called into the canvas by brush, by blood, by prayer in the dark. You see, this was the century when the veil between art and sorcery was thinner than the textbooks admit. Patrons believed they could bind spirits to objects, an old practice cloaked beneath fashionable commissions. And behind the veil of family portraiture, something was hidden. An ancient right of possession disguised as domestic respectability. That is why men who stand before the painting swear they feel judged, not by pigment, not by memory, but by presence. The question you must ask yourself tonight is not whether the eyes move, but whether they recognize you. The family name behind that portrait was Ravencourt. To outsiders, they were nothing more than a respectable New England clan, wealthy merchants with influence in Salem and Boston. But in private, their home was a sanctum of whispers, their gatherings thick with the smoke of candles and the murmurs of forbidden prayers. What the public never knew is that the Ravencourt bloodline had been bound for generations to a shadow network of societies that practiced rites older than America itself. These were not the dramatic rituals Hollywood would have you imagine. No torches, no blood-soaked altars. Their methods were far quieter, far more insidious. A portrait on the wall, a locket around the neck, a mirror angled just so in a child's bedroom. They believed power lived in objects, that a man, or in this case two sisters, could be tethered across time through symbols. If you knew how to prepare the ground, the smallest thing could be turned into a gate. The sisters themselves, Eliza and Catherine, were rumored to be gifted. That word was a polite mask for something far darker. Neighbors whispered that Eliza spoke languages no one taught her. Catherine, barely 10 years old, could tell a man the exact hour his mother died, without ever having met her. They weren't prodigies, they were vessels, and the Ravencourts used them like tools. That portrait wasn't painted to capture innocence, it was a containment ritual. Their eyes, those piercing, unnatural eyes, were sealed into canvas so the family could call upon their gifts long after the flesh decayed. Imagine the arrogance to trap a child's essence, her soul, in oil and pigment, to make her forever available as an instrument of power. But here's the part no historian will ever print. The artist himself, a man named Aldous Crane, died less than a year after completing the work. His hands blackened, they say, as though the paint itself had rotted his flesh. His studio burned mysteriously weeks later, his journals confiscated by collectors who paid well to keep his records buried. The Ravencourts received their portrait intact. Crane received a grave no one visits. So when you stand before that canvas and feel the cold press of eyes against your soul, understand this. It is not metaphor. It is transaction. Someone paid for power, and you, unwittingly, are standing in its debt. To understand the portrait, you must understand the world it was born into. America in the late 1800s was not simply a land of industry and expansion. It was a laboratory of spirits. The Civil War had torn the nation apart, leaving millions of families desperate for answers, desperate to hear one more word from their dead. That desperation birthed a movement, spiritualism. Seances became parlors of hope and control. Mediums became celebrities, and behind the curtains, hidden societies took notice. The newspapers sold it as a fad. Ladies and gentlemen gathered around tables, watched it shake, heard raps on the walls, saw faint apparitions in candlelight. They called it entertainment, but the men with power saw something else. They saw the hunger of the masses. They saw a tool. Control the rituals, control the symbols, control the belief, and you could control the mind of a people. And here's the truth buried in silence. Many of those seances were staged, yes, but not all. Some were very real, and those with access to the real ones learned that the veil between the living and the dead could be manipulated, engineered. That veil was not merely spiritual, it was psychological. Once a man believes the unseen is speaking to him, he is no longer anchored. He is pliable. The Ravencourt family was not dabbling for amusement. They were initiates. They sat in the private circles, the closed rooms, where the wealthy and the powerful met with mediums behind locked doors. The portrait of the sisters was not an isolated eccentricity. It was a fragment of a system, an attempt to bind a family's personal conduits of power. The sisters were not just children. They were the family's investment in the spiritual economy of control. Ask yourself why institutions dismissed spiritualism as folly, while presidents and industrialists attended seances in secret. Ask yourself why scientists who exposed fraud were ridiculed, while those who confirmed the possibility of contact were erased from history altogether. That is not accident. It is management. The elite never wanted you to laugh at spiritualism. They wanted you to ignore the real parts, while they kept the keys. This is where the portrait becomes more than paint. It becomes a map of how families, like the Ravencourts, operated, hiding corruption in plain sight, burying it in tradition, in art, in ritual. You look at a canvas. They look at a doorway. The secret lies in the eyes. Not just these painted ones, but the human response to being watched. Modern psychology will tell you that the sensation of eyes upon you triggers primal fear, because in the wild, being watched meant danger. But what if that reflex wasn't only biological? What if it was cultivated, sharpened, exploited by those who understood it? The Ravencourt portrait strikes terror because the gaze doesn't simply follow you, it judges you. And judgment is the oldest form of control. Eyes remind us of authority, of punishment, of an invisible hand tallying every action. That's why tyrants put eyes on posters, why churches paint eyes in stained glass, why secret societies carve them into their seals. Eyes force obedience without a single word spoken. Now imagine binding that power not to a metaphor, but to something alive. Eyes that are not paint, but presence. That's what the Ravencourts sought. The sisters were raised under strict religious discipline by day, but by night they were taught the art of the gaze. Family law says Catherine was made to sit for hours in silence, staring at strangers until they broke into tears. Eliza's touch was gentle, but her eyes... Men swore she could see their sins. These were not parlor tricks. They were conditioning, ritual, training designed to weaponize perception itself. And when Aldous Crane captured them on canvas, he wasn't just preserving likeness, he was preserving function. The eyes were painted with pigments mixed with ground bone and ox blood, an old alchemical recipe meant to hold memory. They weren't ornaments, they were instruments, instruments meant to outlast flesh. This is where psychology meets sorcery. Once you believe the eyes are alive, they are alive to you. And once they are alive to you, they hold power over you. That is why men recoil before the painting. Not because it moves, but because it commands. The brain cannot disobey the gaze. Now, pause and think how many eyes are upon you each day. Not in paintings, but in cameras, screens, icons, symbols. Do you believe for a moment that is coincidence? Or is it the same ritual, repackaged, centuries old, perfected in silence, now global in scope? When you stare at the Ravencourt portrait, you aren't just looking at two sisters. You are staring into the blueprint of modern control. The portrait of the sisters is a fragment, but fragments reveal patterns. Once you understand the power of the gaze, you start to see it everywhere. Not just in that 1897 canvas, but woven into the very architecture of power. Churches, courts, governments, all learn to master the same weapon, the eye. Walk into a cathedral and lift your head. Stained glass saints stare down upon you. Angels painted in fresco fix their gaze on your soul. The message is clear. You are seen. You are judged. You are never alone. And fear of being seen keeps men obedient far more effectively than chains. Governments mastered this lesson too. Step into a courtroom. The judge elevated, watching from above, while portraits of leaders stare from the walls. The founder's eyes, the president's eyes, symbols that say you will be measured, you will be weighed. Obedience is not requested, it is compelled. Even the secular world is not free from this architecture. In the 20th century, when corporations rose as the new temples of society, they understood the psychology of eyes. Logos designed like symbols of vision, advertisements with models whose eyes follow you from billboards, security cameras placed not only to record but to remind you of your surveillance. The watchers never sleep. This is the continuity. The Ravencourts didn't invent control, they simply participated in it, in their own ritualized, esoteric way. What makes their portrait dangerous is that it exposes the truth that institutions try to hide. The gaze is not just cultural, not just symbolic. It is spiritual. The feeling of being watched is not an illusion. It is a summons. It shapes behavior, molds thought, commands obedience. And when embedded in objects, it becomes eternal. So here is the question. If two sisters could be bound into paint to hold power over generations, how much more has been bound into the symbols that govern your daily life? Every emblem, every flag, every logo staring back at you, do you really think it's decoration? Or are they containers, vessels, just like the Ravencourt portrait? Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Eyes are everywhere because power demands them. To be seen is to be ruled. To be unseen is to be free. And this is why the portrait still matters. It is not only a painting of two girls, it is a confession of the system itself. The Ravencourt family did not simply fade into history. They were not some obscure household whose secrets died with them. Their name was carefully buried, but their influence bled into institutions you still recognize today. That portrait, the one with the sisters' eyes, was not decoration. It was inheritance. An heirloom of power, passed like a relic from one generation to the next. Family archives, sealed by legal trusts and never opened to public record, reveal a disturbing truth. Every Ravencourt heir after 1897 sat beneath that painting during their upbringing. They were made to eat their meals beneath those eyes, to study beneath those eyes, to pray beneath those eyes, by design. Imagine a child being raised under the constant gaze of ancestors weaponized into pigment. That is not family tradition. That is conditioning, and it worked. Descendants of the Ravencourts emerged as lawyers, politicians, financiers. They infiltrated Ivy League institutions, rose through secret fraternities, and carried with them a philosophy their peers never questioned. That true authority requires invisible enforcement, not the lash, not the chain, but the gaze. The reminder that you are always being measured by something greater than yourself. The portrait became a ritual of continuity. Each heir who inherited it swore private oaths beneath its eyes. These were not mere family vows. They were initiations, silent contracts binding them to the same current of power that had been channeled into the sisters. To remove the painting was unthinkable, to sell it impossible. It became the altar of a bloodline that knew the truth. Men are ruled not by force, but by fear of what watches in silence. There are records, hushed and incomplete, of descendants who tried to resist. One nephew tore the painting from the wall in 1923 and stored it in an attic. Within months he was dead from a sudden, inexplicable seizure. The portrait was restored to its rightful place, and family members whispered that the sisters had punished him for defiance. Coincidence? Perhaps. But how many coincidences does it take before you call it design? The Ravencourts guarded their secret well. Publicly, they were pillars of respectability. Privately, they were keepers of a system older than the nation itself. And that painting, those eyes, was the heart of it all. Imagine walking into a drawing room lit only by a single lamp. The wallpaper faded, the air heavy with the musk of a century. And there, on the far wall, hangs the portrait, Eliza and Catherine, the Ravencourt sisters. At first it is only unsettling, a relic of another time, a curiosity, but the longer you stand in front of it, the heavier the silence becomes. The air feels thick, your skin prickles, and then it happens. The eyes, not simply following you, that tired trick of perspective, but pressing into you as though the painted gaze carries weight. Men who have stood before the canvas describe the same sensation, a cold awareness settling on their chest, a judgment creeping into their minds. Some swear the sisters' mouths twitch into the faintest smirk, mocking, knowing. Others insist they heard faint whispers, two voices layered, overlapping, speaking words they could not understand. One collector in 1946 wrote that he avoided the painting at night, refusing to pass the parlor after sunset. I felt watched in a way that stripped me bare, he confessed in a letter, as though my sins were catalogued without mercy. Another visitor claimed the sisters' eyes seemed to darken if you approached too closely, the whites swallowing into shadow, as if something inside the canvas stirred awake. Skeptics laugh, of course. They call it suggestion, imagination, the mind's trick under stress. But the mind's trick is exactly what the Ravencourts sought to exploit. Fear is real, even when its source is unseen. The body reacts as if the threat is tangible. And in that moment of fear, the watcher has already won. But there are darker accounts. A maid, employed by the family in the 1920s, vanished after swearing that the eyes blinked while she was dusting the frame. A scholar who borrowed the painting briefly for study was later institutionalized, raving that the girls knew his thoughts before he spoke them. And always, Always, the pattern repeats. Men and women reduced to silence, shame, or madness under the weight of two painted children. This is not imagination. This is ritual. The painting was engineered to provoke this. Response: to bind your fear into obedience. And if two sisters locked in paint can command such power, what does that say about the symbols that surround you every day, staring from walls, screens, and monuments? The portrait of the Ravencourt sisters isn't just a haunted object. It is a textbook of control. To look into their eyes is to understand how power has always ruled men. The weapon is not the sword, not the prison, not even the noose. The weapon is the gaze, the fear of being watched. You've felt it yourself. When someone stares at you across a room, you shift uneasily. Your body tenses. Your mind races. What do they see? What do they know? That reflex is primal, yes, but it is also programmable. Once you learn to manipulate it, you can govern entire populations without raising a hand. The Ravencourts perfected this lesson privately, but institutions scaled it globally. Think of surveillance cameras, mounted high, red lights blinking, half of them broken, yet their very presence alters your behavior. You don't steal, you don't rebel because you might be seen. Think of religious doctrine, the eye of God, always upon you, watching your every thought, cataloging every desire. Men bend their lives not out of love, but out of terror of eternal observation. And now think of governments. The courthouse walls covered in portraits, the dollar bill stamped with the all-seeing eye. The message is simple and universal. You are not free, you are watched. Step out of line, and the unseen judge will descend. This is not paranoia, it is strategy. Psychologists call it the panopticon effect. The mere possibility of being observed alters behavior more effectively than physical force. Once that fear is seeded, men become their own wardens. They police themselves. They punish themselves. They offer obedience willingly to avoid the crushing weight of unseen eyes. The Ravencourt sisters were engineered to embody this power. Their gaze became eternal, painted, preserved, weaponized. A family heirloom turned into a psychological device. But look around you now. The same device has been scaled to every screen in your home, every camera on your street, every logo etched into the culture of obedience. The question is no longer whether you believe the sisters' eyes were alive. The question is whether you realize how many eyes are upon you right now, and how much of your life has already been shaped by their silent judgment. Fear of the gaze is not only psychological, it is spiritual. The Ravencourts knew this, and so do the institutions that govern you now. To be seen is not merely to be observed, it is to be bound. Bound to the watcher, bound to the covenant of obedience. Think carefully about the rituals you were raised in. The bowed head in prayer beneath the stained glass eyes of saints. The oath sworn in a courtroom beneath the stern gaze of founding fathers. The pledge of allegiance beneath the watching flag. These are not neutral ceremonies, they are transactions. Invisible contracts sealed by your acknowledgement of the gaze. You agree to be seen. You consent to belong. The Ravencourt sisters' portrait was more than a painting. It was an altar, a spiritual tether. When heirs dined beneath it, when they prayed beneath it, they were binding themselves to the eyes, renewing a covenant that stretched beyond generations. It was not art, it was ritual technology. And the power of that ritual was not in the paint, it was in belief. Here is the forbidden truth. Belief makes surveillance real. The eyes do not need to blink. They do not need to move. They only need to be acknowledged. Once you believe you are being watched, you have already submitted. The ritual is complete. This is why the Ravencourts guarded the painting with their lives. Not because they feared losing a decoration, but because the portrait anchored their family's spiritual contract. Without it, they were ordinary men. With it, They were custodians of an ancient power. And is it any different today? The cameras on the street corners, the devices in your pocket, the invisible watchers behind digital screens, none of them need to prove they are watching you. It is enough that you believe they could. You bow, you obey. You censor your own thoughts before they become words. The ritual continues. Understand this, and you begin to see why certain paintings, certain symbols, certain institutions carry the same weight across centuries. They are not tools of culture, they are tools of covenant, and once you consent, even silently, you are theirs. So the portrait of the Ravencourt sisters is not a relic of one family's superstition. It is a mirror of the world you still live in. A world where unseen eyes rule you, not with chains, but with contracts you never realized you signed. By now you understand. The Ravencourt sisters were not just girls trapped in pigment. They were vessels of a ritual that still governs the world you walk through today. Their eyes are everywhere, replicated in cameras, in screens, in symbols you recite your loyalty to without thought. The portrait is no longer about them. It is about you. This is the moment where the descent shifts. Knowledge is no longer safe. Once you recognize the eyes, you cannot return to blindness. Once you see the watchers, you cannot pretend they are not there. And here is the truth you were never meant to realize. The watchers are not simply observing you, they are shaping you. Every word you speak, every silence you keep, every thought you dare not express. That is the cage, and you carry it willingly. But tonight, you have a choice. You can remain as you were, another man lulled into obedience by invisible gazes. Or you can step across the threshold into awareness, where control becomes visible. And what is visible can be resisted. But you must mark that step. So I want you to do something right now. In the comments, type this phrase exactly twice. I see the eyes. Not once, twice. That repetition is not for me. It is for you. The act of writing it, of claiming it, locks this moment in your mind. It brands you as someone who has seen what others remain blind to, and it tells the hidden system that you are no longer asleep. Do not underestimate the weight of this. Ritual is not only for the elite. Ritual belongs to those who act. By typing it, you do more than play into the algorithm. You join a brotherhood of men who refuse to be ruled by unseen gazes. A brotherhood that stares back. The Ravencourts conditioned their heirs by placing them beneath painted eyes. Tonight you condition yourself by naming the eyes, by declaring that you see them. That is the first strike against their power. Recognition. Write it now, twice, and when you do, you will know. You are no longer the one being watched. You are the one watching back. Awareness is not without price. The Ravencourts understood this, and so did the institutions that mirrored them. Those who dared to pierce the veil, who tried to strip away the mask of the gaze, rarely lived long, in peace. It was never enough to recognize the eyes. You had to endure their retaliation. Consider Aldous Crane, the artist who painted the sisters. He glimpsed the truth while creating the portrait. His journals, snatched away by collectors the moment he died, hinted at a terrible realization, that he was not painting likeness, but summoning. He confessed that the girl's eyes grew darker with every stroke, as though pigment were drawing something through me. He feared he had made himself a vessel. Weeks later, his hands rotted, blackened, useless, until death took him. The official report called it infection, but infection does not burn a man's studio to ash days after his funeral. That was cleansing, erasure, or look at the Ravencourt nephew who hid the painting in the attic. Defiance lasted mere months before sudden seizures killed him at 30. The family called it hereditary weakness. Yet his cousins lived long, obedient lives beneath the painted gaze. The punishment seemed selective, intentional, and it is not only the Raven courts. Across history, those who exposed too much of the Watcher's system met with similar fates. Scholars who challenged the power of secret societies were discredited, institutionalized, or erased. Whistleblowers who named surveillance networks were silenced, their lives shredded by scandal or sudden disappearance. Do you really think the system tolerates witnesses? Or does it remind them, as the sister's eyes remind you, there is no escape from sight once you have been marked? This is why the portrait is dangerous. It is not simply cursed paint. It is a lesson encoded in horror of what happens when you defy the gaze. The Raven courts made their heirs sit beneath those eyes to remind them daily. Obedience preserves, rebellion destroys. And here lies the sharpest edge. Once you know the truth, ignorance can never protect you again. To see the eyes is to step into their game. To name them is to stand where others have fallen. And the system, ancient, silent, patient, always exacts its toll. So remember this: recognition is power, yes, but power invites confrontation, and confrontation always carries a cost. The Raven Court portrait is a private relic of control. But what they did in one home, institutions have done on a global scale. You've seen the pattern, now let me strip it bare. Suppression is not random, it is engineered, and it follows a blueprint as old as empire. Step 1. Discredit. When a man begins to see too much, when he dares to name the eyes, the system brands him unstable, a liar, a fanatic. Superstition, they called the Raven Court's rituals. Delusion, they call anyone who questions modern surveillance. But discrediting is not about truth. It is about perception. Once the herd believes you are mad, your voice is harmless. Step 2. Isolation. The whistleblower loses his job. The scholar is exiled from academia. The family member who defies the ritual is cut off, shamed, erased from the family tree. Alone, without community, the witness becomes weak. Men fall into despair when no one believes them, and despair kills faster than any weapon. Step 3. Erasure. If discredit and isolation fail, removal follows. Sudden death, sudden scandal, sudden disappearance. The Raven Court nephew, Aldous Crane. The countless nameless men institutionalized for madness after claiming to be watched. And in our modern world, the journalists who vanish, the reformers who die in mysterious accidents, the dissidents who are silenced before their revelations can spread. This is not new. It is the same system refined. The Raven Courts conditioned their heirs with the portrait. Institutions condition nations with symbols and punishment. The message is identical: obey or be erased. And yet, here lies the paradox. Suppression confirms the truth. If the eyes were nothing, if the watchers were powerless, there would be no need to discredit, to isolate, to erase. But because the gaze is real, because the power it holds is real, those who resist must be destroyed. Otherwise, the illusion collapses and the herd begins to see. This is why the portrait still matters. It is not merely haunted, it is instructional. It teaches us how the system works in miniature. A family used it to maintain obedience across generations. Institutions use the same pattern to maintain obedience across centuries. Different scale. Same strategy, same invisible chains. And when you understand this machinery, when you see its gears turning, you can never again believe that suppression is accident. It is ritual, a ritual as old as the painted eyes. The Raven Court sisters were painted into canvas. But look around you now. Do you really believe the ritual stopped there? No, it has only evolved, refined, scaled to the size of nations. What was once pigment and brush has become lens and code. The portrait has expanded until the entire world has become a gallery of eyes. The principle never changed. Men are ruled by the fear of being seen. What changed were the tools. Where once it was saints in stained glass, now it is the black glass of your screen. Where once it was whispered judgment in church pews, now it is the silent tally of algorithms recording every keystroke. The watcher no longer hangs in the family parlor. It lives in your pocket, carried willingly, fed daily with your confessions. Think of it. Cameras on every street corner, cameras in every store, cameras in your car, on your computer, in your phone, some dead, some alive, but all with the same purpose, to remind you that you are never unwatched. Do you pause before speaking aloud, before typing a forbidden word, before standing against the herd? That pause is the same shiver a Ravencourt heir felt beneath painted eyes. It is obedience before a gaze that does not blink. And now the watchers no longer need blood rituals or occult pigments, they have algorithms. Invisible judges weighing every word, every purchase, every movement, assigning you a profile, a number, a score. You are already measured, already categorized, already confined. And just as the Ravencourts punished heirs who defied their painted altar, so too does the system punish men who step out of line, silencing accounts, cutting access, erasing voices, with a keystroke. The family portrait was a private covenant. Digital surveillance is a global covenant. You consented the moment you carried the device, the moment you logged into the network, the moment you accepted that your every step could be tracked. You swore an oath without speaking a word. And here lies the most chilling truth. You feel it even now. That tightening in your chest as you wonder whether speaking this awareness aloud carries consequence. That is not imagination. That is the ritual. The gaze no longer hangs in one mansion, it blankets the world. The Ravencourt sisters were only the prototype. You are living inside the perfected portrait. Do not mistake the Ravencourts for originators. They were not architects. They were custodians. The system they tapped into, the ritual they preserved, is as old as civilization itself. The watcher's gaze is not a family invention. It is the backbone of empire. Step back into the temples of Egypt. The eye of Horus carved into stone, painted on sarcophagi, etched above doorways. They told the people it was a symbol of protection. But ask yourself, protection for whom? For the worshipper, or for the priesthood who wielded it as a reminder that every action was measured by a divine eye? Travel to Babylon, where statues of gods were placed in shrines with gemstone eyes that glimmered in torchlight. The priests claimed the statues could see sin, could hear prayer, and men, terrified of being caught by a gaze they could not escape, obeyed. Look at Rome, where Caesars placed their busts in every province, their eyes unblinking across the empire. The people saw stone, but the message was spiritual. The emperor sees you always. And then came Christendom, with its frescoes, its icons, its stained glass saints, always eyes, always watchers. And when the church fractured, secret orders carried the same torch forward, embedding the gaze into their symbols, triangles, suns, radiant eyes etched into seals and coins. The Ravencourt portrait is not anomaly. It is continuity. It proves that families, churches, empires, secret societies all drank from the same stream. They understood that men can be ruled forever if they believe the unseen is watching them. And here is the forbidden thread. The watchers may change names, may change faces, but the current remains the same. From Horus to Yahweh, from Caesar to corporations, from painted saints to digital algorithms, it is the same ritual, the same gaze, the same covenant. Only the frame has changed. The sisters' eyes are terrifying not because they are unique, but because they expose the lineage. A child's portrait in 1897 contains the same architecture as the pyramids, the cathedrals, the courtrooms, the flags. Different masks, same control, This is what you were never meant to notice. History is not progress, it is preservation. The gaze never died. It only evolved, perfecting itself with each generation. And now it has reached its peak. Not in temples, not in portraits, but in a world where the eyes are everywhere and nowhere, seen and unseen, digital and divine. You may think the gaze is about obedience. You may think it ends with surveillance, with fear, with silence. But that is only the surface. The truth is darker. The system does not only want to watch you, it wants to enter you. The Ravencourt sisters proved this. Their portrait was not passive. It was not only a painted reminder of the family covenant. It was a vessel. Their eyes were not their own. Every witness who stood before that frame said the same thing, that the sisters seemed hollow, that something looked out through them. Do you understand what that means? The ritual of the gaze was not to watch but to possess, to make heirs into masks, to replace identity with obedience so complete that it became indistinguishable from the self. This is the hidden purpose of control systems. Surveillance is the doorway. Possession is the goal. If you obey long enough, if you fear long enough, if you bend under the gaze long enough, you are no longer pretending. You become what the system wants you to be. And then, like the sisters, you are no longer the one looking out. Something else is. Look at modern men, eyes glued to screens, thoughts shaped by headlines, desires engineered by advertisements, beliefs molded by institutions. They think they are free, yet they speak in borrowed voices, dream in implanted images, react with conditioned reflexes. Tell me, are they not hollow portraits already? Faces animated by a gaze that is not their own? This is the end point of the ritual. Not chains on your body, but chains on your soul. Not obedience under duress, but obedience disguised as identity. A man who has been fully possessed no longer resists, because he no longer remembers who he was before. He defends his captors, praises his jailers, fights for his masters without knowing he does it. The Ravencourt sisters were a warning carved into paint, 2 lives erased, 2 vessels emptied, 2 masks left for the gaze to wear. And now, scaled to the size of civilization, the same process is underway. They don't just want to monitor you, they want to move through you, think through you, speak through you. They want to replace you. The watchers are not content with seeing. They are not content until they become you. The Ravencourt portrait is not just a relic. It is a mirror, and tonight I have dragged you to its surface. You have seen the eyes, you have felt them, and you know the truth. The watchers are still here. They never left. They only changed their frames. Now the choice is yours. You can continue as most men do, hollow, obedient, watched, possessed. A walking portrait animated by forces you never chose. Or you can awaken, and awakening is not comfortable. It is rebellion. It is standing in the center of the room, feeling the gaze on your back and refusing to bow. It is speaking words you were told never to speak, thinking thoughts you were conditioned to bury, breaking oaths you never agreed to take. This is not metaphor. It is life and death. For the Ravencourts, disobedience meant blood. For you, disobedience means exile from the herd, alienation from comfort, erasure from the system. But what is the cost of obedience? To live as a mask, to die never having been a man, only a vessel. Understand this. Once you see the watchers, you cannot unsee them. Once you know their game, ignorance is no longer an option. And this is why knowledge is dangerous. This is why truths like these are buried, mocked, erased, because a man who sees cannot be ruled the same way again. He either submits more deeply or he revolts completely. There is no middle ground. So I will leave you with this. When you next feel the pause before you speak, the hesitation before you act, the weight of unseen eyes on your skin. Remember the sisters. Remember their hollow gaze. Ask yourself, is this thought mine? Or has the portrait already entered me? If you choose rebellion, seal it here. Comment the phrase, "I will not be the portrait," twice below. Not for me, for you. To lock in the transformation, to declare that you will not bow to eyes that are not your own, that you will not live hollow, that you will not die as a vessel. The watchers are waiting, but so is your awakening. The descent is complete. Now the decision is yours.